Welcome to CNBC Evolve, where best-in-class CEOs and innovators from iconic global companies share strategies for competing in an age of disruption and transforming to shape the future. CNBC's Evolve livestream is sponsored by Accenture. Here now, CNBC's Julia Boorstin.
Hello and welcome to CNBC Evolve, Transforming Media. From binge watching to the rise of TikTok stars to the shuttering of cinemas to the sale of first-run movies in your living room. The pandemic has certainly changed the way we interact with and consume all sorts of media. But are these changes permanent? And if so, do media companies have to rethink their entire business models going forward? For the next hour, we're going to take a close look at the evolving media landscape and speak to some of the most innovative names in the industry who are leading the charge. Don Ostroff, Spotify's Chief Content and Advertising Officer, and Franklin Leonard, founder and CEO of The Blacklist. But first, my colleague Carl Quintanilla kicks things off with film and television producer and CEO of Blumhouse, Jason Blum. Carl?
Julia, thanks. It has been a remarkable year of disruption and change in the world of Hollywood. Everything from algorithmic curation to demand for content from streamers to the ways COVID has changed production and post-production. No one knows more about that than Jason Blum, founder of Blumhouse and one of our favorite guests over the years at CNBC. Jason, it's great to see you again. Thanks so much for sharing the time.
Good to see you too. Thanks for having me.
I was struck by your comments in the New York Times just a few days ago, talking about how much change has come to Hollywood because of COVID this year. You said it's shaken the movie business to its bones. And that can mean so many things, not just things that I just detailed a moment ago, but I just wonder, when you say that, what specifically are you thinking about?
I'm thinking about the fact that what COVID did is I think make what was happening over the course of 5 or 8 years happen in 10 months, which is so much of the power has transferred to the streamers for storytellers. And I think it's really accelerated what's happening to the theatrical window. Look, I'm in the camp that I don't think movie theaters are going anywhere, and I think we're going to run back to the movie theaters when we can. I know I am, but I think what we see in theaters, how we see it, how long things play in theaters, I think all that's definitely going to change.
So we should let people know right away, you've been disrupting Hollywood for years. You did it with the overall business model. You did it with how budgets could be done. You did it how you could cast. You did it how you could promote. But when you think about that window, I mean, what is the ideal world for you right now? Do you mind if people see it on streaming the day they could see it in theaters? Do you want to? You've had some experience with this on a couple of films this year.
Yeah, we have. We had at the top of the year, we had Invisible Man and The Hunt, which went to a PVOD window right away. We've continued to release movies both in theaters and on streaming. We had a show on Amazon called Welcome to the Blumhouse, which was a series of 4 original movies we did on streaming. And a couple weeks ago, on Friday the 13th of November, we released a film in theaters called Freaky. Now that film comes out on PVOD this Friday on December 4th. And that's part of what I'm talking about, which is there's a new theatrical model which Universal has embraced. I'm hoping the other studios will embrace. The only hope in my view of how the traditional studios can compete with the streamers is through using this new theatrical window, which is essentially a movie plays exclusively in a theater for a minimum of 3 weeks, could go longer, and then moves to your home. And I think if more studios adapt that, I think over the long term, what we'll see is many, many, many more movies playing in theaters for a much shorter period of time. But I think for the consumer, that's a great thing. Instead of going to your multiplex and having Avengers playing on 8 screens and then 2 other movies on 9 and 10, you'll have 8 different movies playing every weekend. The only thing is they won't last as long. You know, every weekend there'll be a new set of a bunch of different movies. But your ability to go to the theater and see things that are not just horror movies like we make or superhero movies, I think will increase. And I think we've seen until now, you know, the drama has really migrated to television, and there are very few dramatic movies that are released theatrically. I think when windows are shorter, we'll see dramas come back and a bunch of genres that migrated to streaming. Romantic comedy, for instance. We may see more of those in movie theaters with a shorter window.
Oh, that's interesting. I'm thinking about, you know, earlier in the pandemic, people were like, well, okay, we understand if something goes straight to streaming, but they're going to definitely save the tentpoles and the franchise movies for theaters. Then Mulan happened, and then Wonder Woman 84 happened, and then Soul happened. Do you think, is that just about the pandemic? I mean, ordinarily, what's the calculus for what gets a prize showcase in a theater, even if it's just for a few weeks?
Well, there are very few. I mean, save for maybe Netflix, you can't continually make movies at $150 million plus, $200 million plus, and put them on just streaming. It's financially impossible to do. It's not a sustainable model. So if theaters go away, it's certainly the number of tentpole movies that we have are going away. You can't monetize them on a streaming. So for one-offs, like you said, because of the pandemic, we've seen a couple of big movies migrate that way from the studios. I don't think long-term that will happen. I think long-term tentpole movies will continue to play in theaters. They have to. There is no way to monetize them to make them worth the investment to go to play them straight to streaming. Right.
I've got a couple questions about how artistic choices, storytelling choices have changed because of the streaming phenomenon. For example, is it any different today when you are shopping a script? Do you shop it differently to a Netflix than you would to a Paramount? How is that different? And secondly, we all know the experience of you're looking for something to watch. You basically are giving something, 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes before you decide, do we stick with it, honey, or do we switch to something else? I wonder creatively how much more you're having to front load the story, how much character exposition gets sacrificed because you gotta get them in quick.
That's interesting. We haven't. You mean get them to watch a movie on streaming more quickly? I actually,
Or just,
well, say again?
yeah, I was going to say, just to stick with it. It seems like the time allowed to hook a viewer has gotten compressed.
Well, let me first answer your question. The movies that we almost never take a movie to studios and to streamers to just make it to prove your point, which is that, or to make a point, which is that movies that we take to streamers and movies that we take to studios are completely different, for a variety of reasons. Probably the biggest reason is that still to this date, and I think eventually this is going to change, but right now, producers, directors, writers, artists, actors, when they do a streaming movie, they get paid up front. They get paid very healthily and handsomely and fairly up front, but that's all they get. So if the movie is seen by 1 billion people on Netflix or 10 people, you just get your upfront money and that's it, right? A movie for the studios is the opposite. You get paid some upfront, but really where you make your money is how many people see it. When you make a movie for a studio, you participate in how many people see that film. So that would lead any producer, if you have something that's lower budgeted and extremely commercial, you should take that to a studio, right? If you have something that's bigger budget and slightly left of center, you might take that to a streamer. Now, we don't follow what I just said exactly to the letter, but to a large degree we do. It's why I think, and there are good and bad things about that. One of the good things is what the consumer sees on streaming is much more varied than currently what the consumer, or I should say once the pandemic over, what the consumer was seeing in a movie theater. I think they're disadvantaged too, but it's definitely, they're very, very different feeling movies, a movie for streaming and a movie for theatrical. And like I said, we never take movies to one or the other. We either go to all the streamers or we go to all the studios. Now, in terms of getting the beginning front loaded to keep people on the screen, honestly, I think you have to do that in a theatrical movie too. I think if you're a theatrical movie, you can argue the bar is even higher. If the opening of the movie isn't any good, people will walk out of that movie. So we don't change the beginnings of our movie, but we definitely handle the types of stories for streaming and the types of stories for movie studios very differently.
Huh. Is there, would you say in Hollywood right now, I mean, the influx of money from, we'll call it big tech, just to have a way to characterize them, but there's so much more additional funds and additional demand. Is that universally just applauded, or is there this sense, we've always talked about the divide between classic Hollywood and Silicon Valley. Is there still sort of this cultural chasm in between where you're not sure you trust these guys creatively?
I think there's a love-hate for sure. There are things that are terrific about it. There are things that traditional Hollywood people like myself bristle against. I think I think it's declined. The contentiousness between the two. The reason it's declined is because when tech companies started in Hollywood, they just said, we can do this ourselves and we can do this better than the people in Hollywood. But tech companies have come to understand that they do need Hollywood people at very, very senior levels, and I shouldn't say this, very senior Hollywood people at senior levels. They had people at senior levels, they just weren't from Hollywood. Scott Stuber at Netflix, Ben Salke at Amazon. It took them about 5 years to realize that making movies and TV shows is different than doing other things and not terribly simple. And so I think when they started taking senior DNA inside the tent with them, I think the kind of friction got to be a lot less. But there's still, I hate this idea that shows are made because of data. I don't subscribe to that. I think data turns out, if we relied on data, we made a movie called Get Out. That movie never would have happened. And I would say 80% of the movies that we made, Whiplash, Black Klansman, none of those movies would have. We have a show on Showtime right now called The Good Lord Bird. That show would not have been made if we were looking at the data.
Wow. Yeah, all of those movies have done pretty well so far. Let me ask you this.
Data's great for widgets. Data be damned for for creative activity. I mean, could you imagine going to visual artists at a gallery and saying, you know, the data says 29% of people in the metropolitan look at this kind of painting, so make more paintings like this? It's crazy.
Yeah. I have talked, though, to some, for example, some comedians who have a special on Netflix, and they're grateful to have the special on Netflix, but they're not sure that they trust the algorithm. They don't believe necessarily that they're getting placed in front of the right viewers relative to what they had envisioned for their comedy. I wonder, do you trust the curation process that is data driven?
Well, look, that is where the contentiousness still lies. It's a farce to suggest the only data they provide is success. So they say 60 million people saw our show. By the way, saw is defined as watch 2 minutes. So until that, they don't share results. You can't just share success and not failure. It's meaningless, completely meaningless. And until there's transparency with who's watching and how many people, or at least how many people are completing the shows, we as producers have no hope of having any ability to help get our shows in front of the audience that we think we should be reaching. So 100%, not only is it, I mean, the algorithm is a long way away. The first step is getting the streamers simply to share how many people are watching our movie or our TV show from beginning to end. It has to start there, and we're not even close to that.
But you think it's headed that direction?
I don't think that the creative community, at some point, someone is going to start sharing revenue, sharing money, and you have to share that. You have to, in order to be paid per person, you have to be able to know how many people it was, and then know you're going to get a nickel a person or whoever saw it. At some point, some streamer, in my opinion, is going to have to start doing that.
Wow, that would be a sea change. I remember you and I talked a few years ago here in New York, and at the time you said it was a given that a movie would be shot on an iPhone, and eventually that happened. You said, I remember you told me that you thought one day a movie would be shot in portrait mode on a phone, and maybe that has happened. I don't know.
No, that has happened. Yeah.
I just wonder, what innovations have actually surprised you, whether it's been related to the pandemic and changes in production or not?
What innovations have surprised me? Well, the terrific thing, which has gotten better and better and better, it was pretty advanced 3 or 4 years ago, but it's still gotten better and better and better, is that the technology with cameras is such that you need far fewer lights and far fewer people to tell these great stories. And that's not great for employment, obviously, but it's great if you can reduce the cost of making television shows and movies. In my opinion, the television shows and movies get more interesting. The more the things cost, the less risk people take with the storytelling. But the less expensive things are, I think the more interesting things become. And technology has allowed the actual cost of production, COVID aside, COVID makes it expensive. COVID's gonna be over, we're all gonna have a vaccine, and when we go back to life and normal, production is less expensive, and that's ultimately a great thing for the movie and television business.
Yeah, but I would imagine, just like working remotely, what we're doing right now, the technology, the building blocks that were in place, and in filmmaking included, made it possible to get anything done once those COVID limitations came into view, right?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think if COVID had happened 10 or 15 years ago, we couldn't have made anything. I don't think we could have. I think production just would have ground to a halt completely. I think technology has allowed for it. Production is not up to the levels it would be without COVID, but I don't think it's at 50 or 60%, which is a lot higher than it would have been without all the innovations of even the last 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking, like this week, for example, there's a bunch of behind the scenes footage of the Mission Impossible shoot. And sometimes you look at that and you're like, how are they even doing this? Knowing the amount of crew and planning and, sidewalk permits that you need to put your big toe on a sidewalk here in Manhattan anyway. It's incredible that's even getting done at all. I wonder, can you just talk about what it's like being on a movie set these days?
Yeah, it's very compromised. It adds 10 to 20% of the cost, an additional cost to put the COVID, all the rules that you have to put in place to shoot at least relatively safe, as safely as you possibly can. But more than that, it affects the creative. It's just, and we're in this position now. We have a handful of projects that are just about to go. And, I'm inclined to like wait 3 more months and hopefully at that point offer a vaccine to our crews. It has to be voluntary, of course, but the hope is that most of them would take it and you could resume normal production, because the creative, the product, the film or TV show that you're shooting is definitely not as good, even with all the money in the world and assuming you're following all the protocols. The result of what you're shooting will never be as good than when you can get up close to people and talk to people and not wear masks and not do all that stuff. It just can't be. It's making movies is about 150 people getting together and huddling together and doing this very intimate thing where you're very close together. And if you break that apart, you could do it. It's just never as good.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I guess, circling back as we wrap up here in the next few minutes to that Times piece, I mean, it did kind of grapple with the existential questions that Hollywood has always asked itself when the Japanese took it over, when television came along, all kinds of things. But it sounds like your general view is movie theaters aren't dead. COVID's going to bring relief on production. Big tech is probably a net positive, even with some of these cultural rifts. I mean, that seems to be a generally positive view on movie making overall going into the next, say, 5-10 years.
Yeah, look, I have a very, we need human beings. It's like we need stories like we need air. We need stories to live. And people are now, they're not watching them in movie theaters, but they're spending more time consuming stories than they ever have before. That's partially because of the circumstances. I think our inherent desire to be told, watch, hear stories is never going away. And one of people's favorite delivery systems is being in a dark room with a 60-foot screen. And I don't see that. I don't see that experience. Like I said at the top of the interview, I see it changing. I do not see it going away anytime soon. And obviously, the experience at home is getting better and better, and people are consuming more and more there. So I'm very bullish on both television and movies, on both television and movie production.
And to what degree do you think some of the weird one-offs of the pandemic end up lasting longer beyond? For example, when the Academy says you don't have to have had theatrical distribution to be considered for Best Picture. I wonder. Some people wonder if that sticks around or goes away.
Yeah, I don't have. I think it'll. Like I said, I think that it'll. I think the theatrical windows are going to get shortened. So I think the way that they're defining the theatrical, the way that they define the theatrical release is definitely going to change. I read in the story Ava saying they thought they would leave it as a. I don't think the Academy is ever going to. I think they're going to go back. A movie is going to have to play in a theater a certain amount. Otherwise, there really isn't any difference between an Emmy Award and an Academy Award and an Oscar. So I think I'm also a member of the Academy. So I think that it should. You should have a theatrical requirement. But it's shifting. It's shifting. The biggest way I think it's shifting is, like I said, I think the movie business will be much healthier as long as exhibition is included and taken care of in the deal. But that if there's a fair deal made with exhibition to allow movies to play for a much shorter time, like I said, I think that's how we compete with streamers.
No one puts this stuff better than you, Jason. It's always a joy to sit down with you. It's great to see you again. Thanks so much.
Great to see you too. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Jason Blum. Julia.
Thank you, Carl. Joining me now is a woman who has been transforming media for her entire career. First, the cable TV landscape at Lifetime and at the CW, then digital video and magazines at Condé Nast, and now the digital audio space, music and podcasts. Joining me is Dawn Ostroff. She's Chief Content Officer and Chief Advertising Business Officer at Spotify. And she's the reason that the likes of Michelle Obama and Joe Rogan are now part of the Spotify universe. Dawn, thank you so much for spending some time with us today.
It's so great to be here, Julia.
So, Dawn, I want to start off talking about what everyone is talking about on social media, which is Wrapped 2020. I remember when the pandemic started, there were a lot of questions about whether people would be spending less time listening to music and listening to podcasts because they weren't commuting to the office. But now I feel like my social media feeds, whether it's Twitter or Instagram and Facebook, they are dominated by people talking about what they listened to this year. What's your reaction to this Wrapped 2020 phenomenon?
Well, we're not surprised because last year we saw a similar response, but I think this year it's even more meaningful. What we've seen is that the audio platform, music, as well as podcasts have really helped our users get through these hard times. And they've looked to music and podcasts as a means of helping them tackle all of the challenges that we've had this year. And this is a look back on how they've spent that time on platform. And needless to say, there's such a choice of entertainment on the platform to either educate, inspire, escape, whatever the mood may be, you'll find it on Spotify now. So we're happy that the viewer users have had such a great response to it, but we also are not surprised that it's been a really helpful tool to get people through this past year.
Now, Dawn, you really deserve credit for very much diversifying Spotify's business, both in terms of the content and in terms of the revenue streams. And when you look back at the way you built up this podcast business, it's not just by bringing along the likes of Kim Kardashian, making these mega podcast deals with these big names, but also making a number of acquisitions. How did you approach the idea of building a podcast business that was really going to be a destination and get people to switch formats and become subscribers?
Well, it was clearly a vision of Daniel X to be number one in podcasts. And since that was, the mandate, and that's really what the goal was for us, we approached it in a very strategic way. We knew that if we were able to acquire some of the best and key companies in the industry, that we would be able to jumpstart our podcast business, not only in terms of having content and IP that we now own and control, but also as a means of being able to get the best talent in the business under our roof. And so we've had an incredible.
No, please go ahead. I was going to say, yes, it's what's fascinating about it is it's not just about the volume. It's really about the quality in addition to the quantity. So please go ahead.
Yeah, and the quantity has been a story in and of itself, because the quantity, now we look at our library or the content that we have on the platform, we have over 2 million podcasts now on the platform. So it's not just a matter of how many people we have listening to the podcast, but the assortment of podcasts that we can offer our users. As a global platform, we need to have podcasts that not only span all different regions and languages, but also we think about the breadth and the depth of the type of podcasts that we needed to have on the platform. You can understand how we've grown significantly in the past few years. So it's been a combination of getting a significant catalog on the platform. It's been a combination of acquisitions that we were targeting the best and certain categories for the acquisitions that we made. Ringer being, very well versed in sports content. Gimlet is almost sort of the HBO, if you will, of the podcast industry. Parcast is a genre production company, and so we were able to acquire certain companies, and then we were able to actually produce content on our own, which I think has afforded us the opportunity to bring people like the President Obama and Michelle Obama's podcast to our platform. We've been able to make different types of deals with people in Hollywood who typically had not worked in the podcast space, but now are all of a sudden so interested in dipping their toe in the water. And so we're able to expand the type of talent who is coming into the podcast arena. And we're also seeing that even with franchises like DC Comics. We've made a big deal with DC, and we're going to start to explore doing content with the DC characters. So it's a combination of producing our own content, acquiring content, and having the largest catalog on our platform as possible.
You've been credited, Dawn, with sparking an arms race in podcast content, which I think is a quite a compliment. The idea that you've gone after such big names that everyone else has had to jump in the pool. My question for you is, when you look at some of these big names that you've drawn, whether it's the Obamas or Kim Kardashian or Joe Rogan, which was a controversial deal, how you decide that this is someone who has the right kind of followers, the right kind of profile, that we want to make them a centerpiece of our podcast strategy. How do you pick out these big names and convince them to come onto the platform?
Well, there's two ways to look at this. There's the side of how do we make decisions about who we want to go after. And that's really combining art and science, because having worked in television and movies most of my career, it's always been about gut. What do you think is going to work? What is the audience going to be interested in? How are you going to explore something that maybe hasn't been done before and hit it in just the right time and just the right way? But you also have to combine it with the science, which is all of the data that we have on the platform. And it's an incredible luxury to be able to have access to the data and then have the great analytics that we have, which we've built for Spotify to use for not only ourselves, but also for the great creators that we work with. So it's a combination of art and science on our end. What are people interested in? Who is the talent that will resonate with our users? Where's their white space that hasn't been explored, but we have great opportunity with? On the flip side, how do we convince people to come onto the platform and be a part of this new horizon that we're forging a path and building? That's been a little bit easier than I think one would think. A lot of people recognize that this is the next big medium. People want to be a part of this incredible phenomenon. We've seen exponential growth, and we've seen young people migrating into particularly the podcast space. And we know that where the young people go, the older demographics will follow. Even with the Michelle Obama podcast, she brought on millions of new users onto our platform, but millions of new users that included women who are 55 plus. So you can see it's a very strategic approach in terms of who we go after, why we go after them, and then the type of content that we create with them. And then, of course, being able to convince people that podcasting is the next big thing is really something that's made my job very easy, because people seem to really want to work in this space right now.
And it's just amazing thinking of the wealth of data you must have. I first interviewed you when you were running the CW, and that was a disruptive, new industry-defining platform at the time. And to think about the fact that back then you had Nielsen numbers, that was your data, were the ratings, and now you have this very detailed data about how people are choosing things on the platform. I wonder if you have a sense that podcasts are really instrumental in converting people from the ad-supported to the paid subscription. And is that really the centerpiece of the getting subscribers to stick with the subscription service?
Well, we have been quite fortunate because we do, as you said, have dual revenue stream. And so people come in through our free tier, and we see great subscriber conversion as a result of that. It's probably about 60%. And so what we've learned is that by having the free tier, it does definitely drive our conversion onto a subscription model. That being said, I think one of the things that have been underestimated, both externally and maybe by the industry, is the amount of opportunity in the advertising business. What we're seeing is that as the user and as the listener is migrating from linear to digital, and we're seeing more people convert from radio to streaming, the advertisers are following suit. And so we're seeing a significant migration. I think Edison recently came out with some numbers that were pretty meaningful in this space. And then we're also seeing television, which is going through great declines. When you look at the people who have left television and cable, when you look at the demographics of the people who are watching cable and television, very hard to find the younger demographics. And so when advertisers are trying to place their buys, they're looking where they can spend that money and where they can reach a younger audience. And this is the perfect place. In addition to that, if it's on podcasting, and it's music as well, it's just a more intimate relationship that the advertisers seem to be able to have with the user. And I think that is something that the advertisers are starting to really appreciate and respect.
And certainly it seems as a podcast listener myself, the ads on podcasts aren't skippable. They're all just part of the experience. Whereas if you're watching TV and you could TiVo it or DVR it, you can easily skip through. And I think it's really important to point out that, you were hired as chief content officer, you were hired focused on podcasts, but now you are also chief advertising business officer. And that's a huge role, not just in diversifying the content, but also diversifying the revenue streams. Going forward, how important is advertising going to be for Spotify? Will there ever be a world in which advertising is as important as the subscription revenue?
Well, I can't predict where we'll wind up, but I can tell you that I can't remember working in a part of the business where I've seen so much opportunity on the revenue side. And so it's a combination. It's a combination that the podcast industry overall is first going to see significant growth in the pot of money that is going to be migrating over to podcasting. It's a combination of our platform looking at advertising as a significant and meaningful way to add more revenue to our bottom line. It's a combination of what the advertisers can get through the data and analytics that we can now offer them as a digital platform, which they haven't always seen in the audio space. So there's a trifecta of reasons why I think it is going to be an incredible opportunity for us and for the advertisers, and ultimately, hopefully, for the users.
I have to ask you quickly about your experience from all your different fields that you've worked in. I mentioned Lifetime and the CW. You were most recently, before Spotify, at Condé Nast, working on digital video. You've produced films. What is it that you feel like you've learned from those different industries that you're able to now bring to Spotify? I mean, the magazine industry has been completely disrupted. The TV industry, as you mentioned, facing so many challenges. You now have such an advantage having those experiences that you could bring to this much more nascent field of audio.
Well, it's interesting. I have been humbled over and over again in my career, because what I've learned is that great storytelling is what's important across the board, but the way in which you tell stories for any particular medium has to change. So you can't go into making a movie and thinking you can bring in all the experience that a TV writer has and just apply whatever you do in television to film, and vice versa. Similarly, when I went into digital video, I realized that the user has a different expectation when they sit down to watch a shorter form video than they do when they're watching a television show. And I learned that in audio, you need to produce content in a different way, in a way that allows you to really, have the story translate to the user through an audio experience that's going to allow them to use their imagination in a different way than you certainly would if you're watching TV or watching a movie. So there's a lot of learnings each time I've migrated into a different side of the business. The overall common theme is that it's about creating a great environment and a great platform for creators to feel that they can do their best work. And it's about being able to make sure that every story, whether it is nonfiction or fiction, whether it's news or whether it's, it's reality, that it's got to be great storytelling and engaging for the listener or engaging for the viewer, depending upon which medium you're working in. And I think that is what the common theme has always been.
Yes, content is king, as many people have said over the years. And I have to ask about one other industry that you have experience in, which is the video game business. And in addition to TV and film and magazines and digital video, you were recently named to the board of Activision Blizzard, video game giant. And I would say that Activision is interesting because it has made the transition away from reliance on selling physical games to this, this industry that generates revenue all year long after a game has been released. And I'm wondering if there's anything that you're taking from that experience and or any similarities between that business and Spotify as well.
Well, needless to say, Bobby Kotick is probably one of the best CEOs out there. He's done a remarkable job with Activision. And, I learn every time I come in contact with the board on Activision and Bobby and his great team there. But I will say one of the things that I've learned, not only through my experience with Activision, but also just in the industry, is it's so important to stay relevant and to make sure that you always pivot and not be fat and happy sitting, resting on your laurels, because it always comes back to bite you. And I saw this over and over again, even in the television industry. There were so many times where there would be a network that was in the number one position. And instead of taking risks and feeling like they had to find the next big thing, they were just so protective of what they had built. And so that attitude and that sort of, point of view just makes everybody fearful of trying new things. And one of the things I believe Bobby and his team have done very well is they've never been afraid to try new things. They've jumped into the space where they didn't have to because they knew it would probably help them stay relevant with their users and their fans. And I think it's an important lesson for every industry. We just can't sit back. We have to stay lockstep with our consumer, our customer, and we have to be ahead of them most of the time, so that as they're changing, as they're growing in either their habits or their tastes, we're right there with them or a few steps ahead.
So I'm so curious, with that in mind, how you think about innovating within the audio space. I mean, podcasting is still such a young space. Everything you're doing on Spotify is still relatively young. So how are you going to push the envelope there and keep evolving even this young industry? Is it about more digital video, more akin to what you did at Condé Nast? Where is the future of the digital audio space? Is it in video?
Well, it's interesting. First of all, I have to be really clear that we're not the only creatives in our company. We have the most brilliant tech teams that you can imagine at Spotify. And it's interesting because the people that we work with are so passionate about what they are building and all of the products that they're developing, as passionate as we are. So there's definitely multiple sides to this business. And so I have to say that it's the teamwork at Spotify, the respect that we have for one another, that is probably the most remarkable experience I've had so far in my career. The flip side of that is that, we've got so many different ways in which we think the audio business will expand and grow. And so the exploration of different types of content, be it either the different types of genres that we can be making content in, or the different types of audio experiences we can have, I think are first going to be unfolding before our eyes. I also believe in, and that's not just on our end, it's also because there's so many creators in the space now. What we've seen, especially during the pandemic, is that more and more artists on the music side and on the podcast side have decided to try their hand at, expressing their creative side in these mediums, which has been pretty amazing. And so we have Spotify for artists and Spotify for podcasts, which also help encourage users to get into this space, including an acquisition we made earlier this year called Anchor, which is a podcast platform for anybody who wants to try and make a podcast that, we can help them make it, distribute it, and it allows them to get analytics on their podcast. But one of the things that we saw most recently in the launch of Joe Rogan, we did launch Joe Rogan with the video that accompanies his podcast. And we were very surprised at the results because we did see quite a lot of the users were watching his video in addition to listening to the podcast. So it's a big, it's a big question mark, but we've certainly seen that the video did resonate when it was accompanying the audio in an example of Joe Rogan. And we've tried this with a few other podcasters and we've seen really encouraging results.
I'll be very curious to see where that goes. We are almost out of time, but I have to ask you a very quick question. You mentioned the teamwork and collaboration. You are working with Daniel Ek, who is a legendary founder CEO. And I'm very curious how you collaborate and how you work, particularly in these unusual times of COVID when we are all in our homes.
Yeah, it's a challenge for everybody. I think our company was set up probably better than most in that we're such a global company. And as you may know, Julia, Daniel and half of our senior leadership team is in Sweden, in Stockholm, and the other half is really in New York. So we've been accustomed to working remotely for quite some time. This has definitely been more challenging because we do tend to get together every month in either Sweden or in New York. So it's challenging, but at the same time, when you have a group of people who are already so connected, work really well together. We're not a very big team, we're a small leadership team. And as you said, Daniel is legendary and all that you've heard about him is true. He is a remarkable leader. He has great vision and he is a great manager. And so it's been probably better for us than most. And we've been able to grow the company in significant ways this year that I never would have imagined that we could. But the end of the year is really, for us, a lot to celebrate. And we have so much to look forward to in 2021. I can tell you that our company just overall couldn't be more excited for the opportunities that lie ahead.
Well, Dawn, we are very excited to see what comes next, and particularly is there more video in the works? And it sounds like you've had lots of practice doing the virtual meetings and everything in this world of COVID. Dawn Ostroff, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Julia.
Coming up next, meet the founder of The Blacklist. My interview with Franklin Leonard is just 2 minutes away, but first, a quick word from our sponsor.
With a bang, energy and change came to every part of our universe. Seismic or small, it continues.
Change is all around us. Shaped by technology and human ingenuity. We can make it work for you and your business.
Hello everybody, my name is Mark Peters and I'm thrilled to be with you here today. It's no secret that the media industry has been massively disrupted over the past decade. Perhaps the first industry to feel the impact of the digital natives. That's the generation with such high expectations about consuming information. The pandemic and economic uncertainties have fueled the need for media companies to think and act differently. So many of us are now staying home, watching television, movies, playing video games, listening to music, watching short format content. The industry is a more vital resource than ever. And now audiences, and in fact advertisers, expect more value from their time and money. And it's raising the bar for media companies who need to deliver differentiated quality digital services. Services like Peacock and Disney+. These are great examples of that direct-to-consumer strategy. Change isn't limited to television. Production teams working on features are embracing virtual sets and cloud to deliver during the pandemic. But it is television that is forever changed with these new formats for live and pre-recorded entertainment that are now accepted. Longer term, we expect workarounds to morph into permanent changes and to continue using cloud-based technologies and workflows that were so rapidly stood up in response to the pandemic. And so at the highest level, we're witnessing this total transformation, this shift from content to content with a foundation of technology that's so critical to the business. We're moving from media to media tech, and it's an exciting time.
That is certainly true, an exciting time, and we're seeing a transformation not just in how content is produced, but in how people figure out what scripts they should turn into films and television. So with no further ado, I want to bring in now Franklin Leonard, the CEO and founder of The Blacklist, longtime Hollywood executive, someone I've known in this world and in this city of Los Angeles for a very long time. Franklin, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. Excited to be here.
So Franklin, I want to start off with a brief introduction to what The Blacklist is. I think it's important to explain that you started with the idea of crowdsourcing the best content in Hollywood, and then it evolved to a platform to eliminate the inefficiencies in the Hollywood system. So tell me about the initial idea of The Blacklist and then how it evolved to what it is today.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You know, I was working as a sort of junior executive at Leonardo DiCaprio's production company. My job was to find great screenplays and great screenwriters, and I felt like I was doing a not great job. I was looking for a more efficient way to find the stuff that we should be making, and took a survey of my peers and said, share with me a list of your 10 favorite screenplays that have not yet been produced. And in exchange, I will share with you the entire list. It went viral within the industry very quickly at a time when virality was still a relatively nascent concept. It was 2005. And very quickly, those scripts started to get made. The writers that were on the list started having other successes with other films, and it became a thing within the industry that has, you know, given the industry early notice of 4 Best Picture winners in the last 12 years and 12 Best Screenwriting Oscars, including most recently Jojo Rabbit. Since then, we've built on that idea that there is a wisdom in the crowd, and built a 2-sided marketplace online, where anybody who's written an English language screenplay can host their script on the site for a small fee, pay to have it evaluated by readers that we've hired from within the industry. And if that script is good, we can then tell everybody in the industry, hey, this is a good script and a good writer. You should pay attention to this. And we've seen hundreds, if not thousands at this point, writers get noticed via the site and go on to successful careers as professional screenwriters.
So what's so interesting to me about this is it's a total sort of reversal of the structures and the limits on the system before. Before, to get a script read, to get it made, it really helped if you knew someone. Explain to me how you're really democratizing the process, and how different it is. And I don't know if you have any success stories you want to share of people who didn't have the connections, who were able to get agents and get into this business as a result of The Blacklist.
Yeah, I mean, look, the website was really born of, I would be invited to speak as the Blacklist guy at this annual survey. And the first question that would inevitably be asked during the Q&A was, well, I wrote what I think is a pretty good script. How do I get it to somebody who can get it on the Blacklist and hopefully get it made? And I didn't have a good answer to that. The answer that I would find when I would ask people who were more senior in the industry was, well, you should submit it to the Academy Nickel Screenwriting Competition. If you place in the top 100 out of 7,000, someone will probably call you. But other than that, you know, move to Los Angeles, network until someone pays attention to you. And look, I'm a Black guy from West Central Georgia. I'm acutely aware of the way in which access issues can pervert an entire industry. And I think that's very true here. Just because, you know, if you're a suburban dad in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, or a single mom in Chicago, and you don't want to pack your kids up and move to Los Angeles to try to be a screenwriter, that doesn't mean you're not a talented writer and a talented storyteller. And Hollywood, you know, I think for a long time has always been in the business of assuming that great talent would come to them. But we really need to be in the business of seeking out that great talent and providing an infrastructure so that if you are talented, we can more easily find you and then work together to make things that can be part of great culture and have really good economics.
And you mentioned that there are thousands of screenwriters that have been able to find some level of success in the industry through this. Are there any particular examples that come to mind that really illustrate how someone could go from a small town to getting noticed in Hollywood?
I mean, my favorite story is probably a husband and wife team of writers from not far from my hometown in Georgia who uploaded a script in the English language, a small contained thriller, and had Imagination Abu Dhabi reach out to them and ask about the Arabic language rights to their film. That movie ended up being produced as an Arabic language film called Zinzana that ended up playing the London Film Festival, and I believe was the first ever Arabic language acquisition at Netflix. And that was several years ago. I mean, there are countless other stories. Minhal Baig, who made the film Hala, that was at Sundance and is available on Apple, is an alumna of our first ever Screenwriters Lab. And many of the writers on the annual list every year were discovered by their representatives on the website. And then as their script was shared widely within the industry, ended up being selected as part of that crowdsourcing that we do with hundreds of executives at the end of every year as one of the most liked scripts in the industry.
Fascinating, amazing. And you mentioned your Screenwriters Lab. You've gone from just being this platform to now also doing all of these other things that not just democratize, but also bring greater diversity to the industry. Tell me about the lab and some of the partnerships you've had in the past with different studios.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think fundamentally we see ourselves now not just as an annual survey, not just as a platform whereby writers can sort of get discovered. We see ourselves as an organization that identifies and celebrates great screenwriting wherever it can be found. And especially in the places where historically Hollywood has failed to find it. So in order to do that, we can't just tell everybody, hey, here's a good script. Oftentimes we want to provide support to writers to improve the quality of their work. Thus our 3 Screenwriters Labs every year. We do 1 writing lab for feature writers, and then we do 2 labs collaborating with women in film for women writers in film and in television. We've partnered with a number of studios, Warner Brothers, with Google very recently to provide grants for writers who are working on their next project, or blind deals at the studios so that writers can be employed and work with the studio in order to write something that they'll be compensated for and hopefully be able to get made. Again, our goal is to find partners who are looking for talented writers who are trying to make excellent movies. And we found an efficient way to, find those needles in a haystack by making the one and only metal detector that exists in the industry of this sort.
That's such a great metaphor. And it sounds like your real mission is to elevate writers across the industry, even if they have no connections, no experience, just to let the best content find a home in Hollywood.
That's right. Look, I've always been a fan of meritocracy, and I think that if we can create a true meritocracy, we'll actually have a far more diverse industry than we do now. Again, we are not, as an industry, sourcing the best talent. And until we do, the economics of the industry are always going to be fatally flawed.
So tell me about your latest partnership. I understand you have a new one to announce with us here today.
Yeah, I figure why not make a little bit of news. I'm very excited to announce that The Blacklist is going to be partnering with MGM to find 4 writers over the next 2 years who will receive a 2-step Guild minimum blind deal to develop a screenplay with the studio that's worth about $100,000 for their work. And the goal of this partnership is explicitly to find writers, new voices with unique perspectives from historically underrepresented communities. And specifically, we're looking for writers who have not made more than $500,000 within the last 10 years. So maybe you've written a script that sold, maybe you were on a television series, you're writing for a television series for 1 year, but for whatever reason, you haven't had the opportunity, having nothing to do with your talent, and we're going to make that opportunity available to you via MGM. And I couldn't be prouder of that partnership. If you're interested in learning more, go to our website. It shouldn't be hard to find via your local search engine. But again, the key thing here is finding great writers, because there are great storytellers everywhere that have not up to now had access to the resources or the relationships to allow them to have the opportunities to tell their stories on the various screens in which we consume them. And we're all going to be better off as audience members if we're finding them.
The powerful democratizing force of technology and an open platform, and very exciting to have you announce that with us here. But Franklin, a question: when you look at the landscape right now, and we just heard from Jason Blum about all the pressures on how it's harder to make movies in the time of COVID. He said he thinks the content isn't as good if it's produced under these limitations. And then you have the fact that things are shifting to streaming. More content is being streamed than ever before. And now we just had this Warner Brothers news about, they just broke moments ago about films being released in theaters at the same time that they're going to be available on HBO Max. And Franklin, I'm curious for your thoughts on why your tools are more valuable now at a time when there are all these constraints on the industry. And then we have to talk specifically about this this closing window between theatrical and at-home release. But first, I'm curious about sort of where the blacklist fits into this new constrained Hollywood system.
Yeah, I mean, I would take issue, I think, with Jason's observation that it's harder to make good movies, or that it's impossible to make great content amidst COVID. I have a great deal of trust in the creatives to be able to make great movies and great television under incredibly adverse circumstances. But what I would say is that, you know, again, Hollywood has historically not sourced the best possible talent. You know, I've analogized it before to the NBA prior to integration, right? We were only sourcing a certain group of people that happened to know people who were already in the industry or who had the resources to make their move to Hollywood. By going out, by seeking out the best talent, whether they can afford to move to Los Angeles or not, whether they can afford to sort of develop the relationships with the industry or not, and focusing primarily on the merit of the work and the merit of the talent, you know, we have stronger inputs. And I think with greater competition amongst those inputs, you know, along with providing them the resources necessary to make good content, the result of that should be higher quality film, higher quality television, more better stuff for us to enjoy as audience members, which should make the economic argument and the business models a lot easier to sustain.
Certainly, and it seems like now one thing I hear a lot about is that there are possibly going to be fewer films in theaters, or fewer films exclusively in theaters, and more films that are going straight to streaming services. I'm wondering if you're concerned that the types of movies that the blacklist tends to elevate, the Oscar movies that are usually released this time of year, they're not going to be released this year because half of the theaters are shut down right now. Are you concerned that the highest quality films, the films that used to get the critical acclaim as well as the awards, are not going to have a place in theaters anymore? Did we just lose Franklin? Well, we may have just lost him there, but look, that is really the. There you are. You're Franklin. You're back. Sorry, we just lost you for a moment.
I think. Sorry about that. You know, this is the reality of COVID life.
Exactly.
My belief. Like, I just joined the board. I just joined the board of the American Cinematheque. I'm a die-hard lover of the film-going experience in theaters, and I don't believe that that's going anywhere. However, I also think that, you know, Ava's comments in the recent New York Times article, I tend to share. I think that there are a wide variety of opportunities that exist in this new environment, and I'm frankly excited for them. A lot of these movies that may be in theaters in New York and Los Angeles were not in theaters in my hometown, and a lot of the small towns throughout the country and around the world. Now we have a time when those films can go directly to literally everybody with an internet connection and enjoy them. And not for nothing, you know, I was looking at Netflix and Amazon's offerings in the fourth quarter of this year. Netflix is going to spin off between October 9th and December 18th, 40-Year-Old Virgin, His House, Jingle Jangle, and Ma Rainey's Black Bottom. That's 4 films by Black filmmakers, all with Rotten Tomato scores above 95. I don't believe there's been a studio to do that ever prior to now. And not only are they putting them out, they're making them available to audiences who never would have had them in a traditional theatrical model.
So as people are concerned about the movie theaters and as their stocks suffer on that Warner Brothers news, there is the silver lining that ultimately more content is going to be available to more people, more opportunities for the cream to rise, or whatever that cliche is about the needle in the haystack. As you put it, you have the metal detector. Franklin, I want to thank you so much for joining us. It's so wonderful to get your insight into the industry and to hear about how you are disrupting it and evolving it with technology and open platforms, creating new efficiencies in what was a very inefficient and closed system. So Franklin Leonard, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you all for joining us today for CNBC's Evolve, Transforming Media. For more about our Evolve live stream series, you can go to cnbcevents.com.